I'm pleased to announce today, and actually announce here, the launch of a new firm, which is called Nexus Insights. And this firm is going to help companies both inside and outside our industry and the aging services space. It's specifically going to help them rethink how we view older adults and aging and reimagine aging services. It's my view that we can and must do better, that the status quo is really not acceptable. And that's what this company is all about. If you want to learn more, go to www.nexusinsights.net. So enough of the commercial, but I did want you to know why you suddenly see Nexus Insights up there. Now, today I've chosen as my topic COVID-19 and the new normal. What does this mean for the future of senior living? And, you know, in writing this, I realize right now that we are literally, it's as though we're in the midst of a war right now. And I did a recent LinkedIn blog post where I talked about our industry being on the front line, and in particular, our workers in our communities, our frontline workers, caregivers, dining service, all sorts of individuals, maintenance workers and so forth, are really on the front line. And I drew the analogy to a war setting where we're defending the most vulnerable sector, if you want, or piece of territory to this enemy, the enemy being this virus. And we're doing it with faulty and inadequate intelligence on the enemy, the location, and conflicting direction and orders from commanding officers, and then finally, totally insufficient weapons and information, weapons and ammunition, I mean. In other words, we're kind of on our own, oftentimes it seems, to find tests, to get PPE, and so forth. So in that situation, you know, our industry's on the front line of a war. And there was a really good piece in the Nick Notes blog post that was based on feedback from providers around the country, from NIC's Executive Insights survey. And it was really summed up in a quote from one of the participants, one of the providers, who said, "We feel we're all alone in a war zone." And I recognize that. I've written about that. I'm passionate about the value of what we are doing, and particularly what our staff are doing right now as real heroes, as I wrote about in a piece with Jacqueline Kung that recently appeared in The Hill, a publication that in the public policy realm. But another piece that I think is important to recognize is that the way I put it is our industry performance in weeks 1, 4, and 6 of the crisis is judged by the knowledge of the enemy, meaning the virus, as of week 8. This is a classic sort of thing about, if you want, Monday morning quarterbacking. But what I'm saying here is what we know now, we apply back to how those of you who are on the front lines at the very beginning, how you reacted and what you did. And we didn't do everything perfectly, no question about that. But there's, to a great extent, one could say, we on the front lines and many others in hospitals and in government were caught unawares and unprepared for this enemy. But the response, I think, of our sector has been incredible. So I want to now, though, transition to, if that's our present situation, how about when I said in my title, COVID-19 and the new normal, what does this mean for the future of senior living? I said that, and I chose that topic for a reason. And my purpose today, and in my comments in our discussion, is hopefully to help you realize that though you're very much in the thick of the fight, on the front lines, supporting your teams, that we also have to we have to sort of pick our head up for a moment and begin to think what's over the hill or what's after this. What does this crisis, not only the health challenge, the epidemic itself, the economic challenge to our national economy, what's this going to mean for my company, for my business model, and what's it going to mean for my customers? So we need to begin to build the future. And that's what I really want to help with, just generate some thoughts and some discussion this morning. Henry Kissinger did a really good piece in the Wall Street Journal, April 3rd, called "The Coronavirus Pandemic Will Forever Alter the World Order." And he made a statement there that you see here. This historic challenge for leaders, the historic challenge for leaders is to manage the crisis while building the future. And indeed, I think that that's part of my point this morning. As leaders, as all of you are leaders in the senior living space and in aging services, we need to both manage the crisis at the same time while we're anticipating and building the future, so that, again, the future doesn't catch us flat-footed, and that we're really preparing. Kissinger goes on to say, the crisis effort, however vast and necessary, must not crowd out the management task of leading a parallel enterprise for the transition to the post-COVID order. So this parallel enterprise of leading of the transition to the post-COVID order. He chose the analogy to World War II and the preparations for NATO and things such as that. In my comments this morning, I want to talk about, well, how is this crisis going to change our field, change senior living, and what are ways that we may begin to think about and prepare for that? So, first and foremost, there will come a time when we will see the pandemic in the rearview mirror. There will not come a time when we will return to the old normal. There'll come a time when, yes, this crisis is in the rearview mirror. For many of you, I know you hope that comes sooner and not later. You hope that's not 12 or 18 months from now, though it possibly may be. But regardless of how long that is, there won't come a time when we're going to return to the new normal. So I want to do a couple things here. First, I want to quickly go through some tailwinds and then headwinds for our industry. I'm going to go through these very quickly. The reason is that I don't want to focus on these. I really want you to have them almost more as background, and they're things we can discuss offline or later on in our chats today. But I just wanted to acknowledge these, even though it's a partial list. Then I want to focus this morning on what I call key takeaways. My first thoughts about key takeaways, about lessons learned and what this means for the future. And then I want to close on what I call key questions or unknowns, things where honestly we just can't say yet because we don't know. We either don't have the data or it's just too soon. So first of all, tailwinds. I've listed a number. It's a partial list. The leap forward in the use of communication technology. And again, I'm not going to read through these. You have them there. Just as I said, this is almost by way of background. And you know, the spotlight on the importance and contributions of frontline workers, the siloed thinking in healthcare and senior care, just beginning to break down some, increased data and idea sharing in the industry and with those outside. Partnerships formed in the crisis may pave the way for ongoing collaboration post-crisis. A forced spotlight on how we fund or don't fund long-term care for the frail, poor elders, and a reconsideration of the value proposition for seniors housing, something I'll return to, and the necessity of better segmentation of our market and product. Now, headwinds. Again, a partial list. I've deliberately made each list just about as long, about the same number of points, because there are both enormous tailwinds, meaning things where the wind's at our back. There are really positive opportunities that this crisis creates. There are also, though, real challenges and headwinds. One of the first is the failure by media and many government leaders to distinguish between seniors housing and Medicaid-funded nursing home care for very frail, poor older adults. The fear of congregate settings as dangerous for one's health. The view of seniors housing as exclusively need or care-driven and to be avoided if at all possible. And again, I'm not going to read through all these, but I've put them down here so that you have them. The huge shift to embracing delivery and management of healthcare at home, that's both an opportunity, but it's also a challenge for us. And I think a couple things on here, the renewed focus on quality of care, undercutting focus on quality of life. One of the whole points and value propositions, I would argue, of seniors housing has been about quality of life. And so that, yes, I may be at risk at fall, but if I want to take that walk, I should be able to, because it's quality of life that's more important. But I think now we're going to see a renewed focus on quality of care. And the danger is that it reshapes our sector. And we sort of repeat the mistakes of what happened with the skilled nursing sector in terms of so much focus on care and regulating care that quality of life really sort of gets left behind. And then lastly, ageism in healthcare and the society at large, the disregard for the value of older adults, often deemed expendable. Okay, so that was rapid fire, deliberately. Now I want to spend some time on key takeaways. These are my thoughts as president of Nexus Insights. I'm not speaking for NIC today when I say these things, but these are some of my thoughts on the key takeaways. The first one is that we're now part of the healthcare continuum for better and for worse. And it'll be tough to have it both ways. What do I mean by saying this? Well, what I mean is, on the one hand, we're now part of the healthcare continuum and we've lobbied for it. We've lobbied to be viewed as we should be level 1 priority, not as we are now, level 2 priority for such things as rapid testing ability and such things as PPE, and also for having access to the stimulus funds, recognizing the additional costs that we've incurred in trying to protect and care for our residents. So in all those ways, we've lobbied for and we've been successful, at least in part, in being viewed as a critical part in the response to this epidemic of the healthcare continuum. But that also has a double-edged sword side to it, because at the same time, if we're part of the healthcare continuum, then there's going to be increased regulatory scrutiny and focus. And it's going to be very tough to have it both ways, saying when it comes to resources, we want to be part of the healthcare continuum. When it comes to regulation, we don't want to be. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge for our sector. Much of private pay seniors housing has always said, we don't do healthcare in our buildings, and therefore we're not part of the healthcare continuum. But I think the arguments, rightly, I think, that have been made during the course of this epidemic, and that we need to be viewed as part of the continuum, and not just part of it, but literally, again, we're on the front lines. If our healthcare system overall is going to keep people out of the emergency room and just overwhelming hospitals, one of the major keys is what goes on in our communities and our ability of our staff to care for residents, to both protect them from infection and at the same time to care for them. So again, we're now part of the healthcare continuum for better and for worse. Secondly, this is perhaps obvious, but it needs to be stated. affordability is going to be a greater challenge for our sector than ever, but it's also a huge opportunity. And what I would say is that basically wealth span is going to be just as important to residents and their families as health span. So you have age span, how long you live. You have health span. How much of that time that you live, do you live in reasonably good health, able to do things that are important to you, and not just preoccupied with your aches, your pains, and your limitations. And then lastly, wealth span. And ideally, of course, all three. That age span without both health span and wealth span is not a desirable situation. So it's an enormous, I think, opportunity for our sector, but we're going to have to rise to the challenge because affordability of our product for private pay seniors housing is going to be a greater challenge than ever before. NIC did our Forgotten Middle study, looking at 75 population in 2029 and their ability to afford our product at today's prices. And obviously, we don't know how much, but that affordability has definitely been lessened, probably significantly as a result of the events of the last 6 weeks. Next point I would make in my key takeaways is that transparency is required or trust is lost, sometimes never to be regained. I think the message over the last couple of months and the message in our sector, and I'm including now skilled nursing as well as seniors housing, is that continuous, caring, and credible communication is essential. It's essential with residents and their families. It's essential with staff and their families. And it's essential with the media, with public officials at all levels. And so it has to be immediate, it has to be continuous, it has to be caring, and it has to be credible. And the flip side of this is that I think the importance of transparency has never been greater than in a crisis such as this. And it's either an opportunity to, in a sense, affirm and cement the public's trust in your credibility, or to lose it. And when you lose it, it's very hard to get it back. And so I would argue that the lack of transparency, the lack of whatever may seem to be the risk of immediate, continuous, caring, and credible communication is then the presumption of guilt, the presumption that you're seeking to hide something, that you've done something wrong, which you may not have, but the presumption is that you've done something wrong and that you're hiding something. And so you see different media stories picking up on that kind of theme. So I would argue that this crisis and the response to it has shown the absolute critical necessity of transparency. It's required, or else you lose trust. If you lose trust, no amount of marketing dollars and no size of a marketing budget can regain that. That is critical. That credibility is critical. So the fourth one, and if you're counting, I've got 13 of these. So the fourth one is that the congregate living model for seniors housing did not die or will not die with COVID-19 deaths, even though some undoubtedly will predict that it will. But it's going to have to look and be marketed very differently in the future. I'm going to say a number of things about this as we go on to other points as well. But let me just make the point, when I talked about age span, health span, and wealth span, that health span has got to be, it's a focus on health, not just health care. And a health span focus means engagement, not entertainment. It means living and not dying. And what I'm saying here is that the congregate living product has got to be, it's got to look like, and it's got to be marketed as a metaphor for being alive, not a place to disappear and die. And this is a challenge for an industry that's increasingly marketed care to meet needs. And so our communities have got to be places that offer experiences, engagement, human connection, refiring a sense of purpose that lift the spirit and connect with life joys and a sense of belonging, connection, and purpose. So as I've said in other settings, we've got to be folks where our activities directors are not just entertaining people as we and they are preoccupied with their limitations, whether they're mobility or cognitive. No, we've got to be purpose matchmakers, either re-engaging, refiring, or simply enabling folks, whatever their limitations, physically, mentally, to pursue what gives them a sense of life joy, a sense of life satisfaction, and life engagement. An entertainment model will not be a model that can overcome a fear of the congregate setting in the future, in my belief. The next thing in terms of a key takeaway, and is my sense is that we've got to develop a product that appeals to boomers now, not when they need or must have care in 10 to 15 years. The oldest boomer is 74 now. There's an 18-year run of boomers, meaning that's the size of that cohort. So yes, the first boomer is not going to be in their mid-80s until at least 10 years from now. And many of them are not going to need care services in terms of assistance on site with caregivers for a decade or more. But I think there's an enormous opportunity now and need now to develop and demonstrate a lifestyle product that is attractive to boomers, that focuses on wellness, on health, and prevention, along with engagement, human connection, and what I'm calling this refiring of a sense of purpose and belonging to the greater community. So I think these things are if the challenge of this pandemic is that for some boomers, it can confirm almost their sense that senior living is senior dying, meaning it's a place where you go to die or where you're more likely to die. And that is a very negative connotation. And for those of you involved and have been involved in this field for years, know it's the antithesis of what we do when we do well, when we engage residents and where we affirm what they have to offer now, and we help them either continue or to rediscover things that give them a sense of giving back, that they're not just objects or helpless individuals to be served, but rather they're individuals, they're mature older adults who have something to give back to the community and something that we need in our society. So another way of putting this is that I think there's a huge opportunity. Some are experimenting with different models, but there's a huge opportunity to develop a product that's a congregate living model product that appeals to people in their early to mid 70s and not focus just on a product that appeals to people in their mid to late 80s and beyond. This is a huge opportunity, but it's also, I would argue, a necessity. The next key takeaway, building on one of the headwinds and tailwinds, you'll notice a number of my headwinds and tailwinds, they appeared in both places, meaning they were both an opportunity and a real challenge, a headwind. And that's true for telehealth and telemedicine. Almost overnight, in a way that none of us, I think, certainly I, would not have anticipated possible, telehealth and telemedicine have gone mainstream in healthcare. And the implications for seniors housing and care are huge and cannot be ignored. As I said here, seniors housing and skilled nursing won't be able in the future to get away with, and I have deliberately put it that way, with sending residents to the hospitals or the doctor's office for their health care. Or put another way, to use the emergency room and paramedics as a key part of our overnight shift. It won't work in the future. Why? Three things I'd say. First of all, residents and their family members won't be willing to accept that. Why? Because now, rather than the first option, oh, I feel better, mom's being sent to the hospital, now suddenly there's a recognition that maybe being at the hospital is not the best thing for me. Or maybe going to the doctor's office and sitting there and waiting for an hour in a room of sick people is not the best thing for my 88-year-old mom. And so I think residents and their family members won't accept that kind of model of senior care in the future. Secondly, the technology is now available and being accepted. So there's not an excuse anymore to say we can't do this. And thirdly, payers, those who are holding, particularly through Medicare Advantage or managed long-term services and supports, managed Medicaid, those who are holding the healthcare dollar risk, they are not going to be willing to pay for those higher cost, more institutional settings, such as those stays in the hospital or the move from an assisted living community to a skilled nursing community. They know now that there are alternatives to that, and they're going to insist and they're going to incentivize their clients, their plan members, to be going to places that offer those options. So I think this is a really key, even at the NIC Spring Conference in the very beginning of March, some of the ideas around telehealth and telemedicine, many people were still seeing, well, this is the future. And I may have 3 to 5 years at least before that future arrives. Guess what, folks? That future has arrived. It is now. And I think for the delivery and payment mechanisms for healthcare, telehealth and telemedicine have arrived, and there'll be no going back to the old normal. As some have put it, the toothpaste is out of the tube, or the genie's out of the bottle. CMS is not going to go back to old models that restrict telehealth and telemedicine only to rural areas, only to pre-existing relationships for physicians, and all the restrictions that have now disappeared with a stroke of a pen over the last month. So an important point. If you're planning a senior living community now, in terms of design and development, if you're not thinking about what this means for that setting that you're building now, you're making a huge mistake. All right, next, the value of the frontline staff in our industry and the need to demonstrate strong support for them has been proven. But what does this mean? It means there's no going back to the pre-COVID-19 valuing of frontline staff. Now, I'm not in any sense saying that this has all been a sudden, gee, we need them, so we're doing these things for them, and we'll go back to taking them for granted. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that just as CMS cannot, with a stroke of a pen, mainstream telehealth and telemedicine, and expect that then after the crisis, it's going to go back to restricting the application of that. So too, the things we've done to champion the heroes on our teams, and even the practical things from providing food that they can take home to their families, coming up with daycare options, having employees that, as some have done, where the first day they start with us, they instantly have health care. so that that 60-day or 90-day wait period is waived. And even the higher wages, however it's done, through bonuses, through basically a crisis time incremental increase. All of these things and all of the recognition of how dependent our residents and our very value premise is on our frontline staff, and how important it is to demonstrate a strong support for them. We're not going to be able to go back on that, and that's going to have implications for business models. So we can talk more about that. I think one of the things that will differentiate providers in the future is their ability to continually do and demonstrate this, and particularly their culture, because this has brought out that the things you do now in the crisis, you're able to do because you're building on a strong culture. And culture doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long-term commitment and investment. But those providers that have strong cultures have been providers who've really been able to rise to this unbelievable challenge and really work as a team at all levels of their organizations and their communities. And I think this will be a key differentiator for recruitment and a key differentiator for performance going forward. Next, again, this may seem obvious, but I want to stress again the point I'm saying many times. There's not going to be a return to the pre-COVID-19 era, and in this case, of communication. My friend Bill Thomas has said that, senior living has finally entered into the digital era of communication, and talking about the last 6 to 8 weeks. And I totally agree with him. I would argue that the failure to embrace fully digital communication with residents, their families, staff, healthcare partners, and healthcare payers will be fatal going forward. Again, has enormous design implications for our communities, but it's also just a practical way of doing business. And again, I think the presumption will be, if you're not able to communicate digitally in the future, that you're hiding something or there's something lacking in what you have to offer. And so I think, and again, the ability to coordinate digitally in terms of sharing information in real time with healthcare partners and healthcare payers, as well as the communication with residents, their families, and with staff. So again, this is another one of several things where we're not going to return to the old normal. And what that means is it has major implications for how we think about our product and our delivery going forward. This one, the pool of potential labor, because of all the layoffs, 22 million Americans filing for unemployment claims just in the last 4 weeks. The pool of potential labor is swelled enormously, but the costs of our labor have risen significantly, both literal costs in terms of wages, all the ancillary costs of supplying them what they need to do their job, which includes PPE and COVID-19 testing ability, as well as whatever training is needed. And so the pool is larger of labor, the costs for this labor are higher, and the value proposition, I'm arguing, must be proven through culture and care for staff. Goes back to my earlier point. But this is here I'm focused on this new pool of workers, millions of folks out of work, millions of folks that have service experience. They've served in hotels, they've served in restaurants and in the dining sector. They've served at spas or gyms, or they've served in the cruise industry. So they're used to serving people. And they need a job. But to recruit them while they're out of work, we've got to address two things. One, the real fears from what they're reading and hearing about working in our sector, meaning fears in terms of exposure, in terms of their health and that of their families. And secondly, we've got to demonstrate to them the value proposition for them of being involved in senior living. And the value proposition, in other words, of being able in the future with a hug, and now with even more creative things that don't involve a hug, of demonstrating how, yes, you can absolutely make someone's, you can be that person that not only makes that person's day, but also as a resident, but makes their family's day. And ultimately, you can form a relationship with folks where that relationship is one of the things they look forward to each day. The relationship itself gives them a reason and a sense that they are important to someone. Someone else is looking forward to seeing them the next day. And so whether it's that connection that you provide as staff, or that connection that you're involved in through the programs and engagement activities. But more than anything, we demonstrate that we're a sector where we make a difference in people's lives every day. We give them purpose, a sense of hope, a sense of human connection and belonging. That's a message we've got to get out, not just that we're a place to provide care. That's, I don't think, what's going to really make us incredibly successful in recruiting and overcoming the fear of the congregate setting, which is real and which is out there. This next point, I don't want to labor this. My comments and the things I'm saying this morning are not primarily focused on policy, but we can't ignore it. And the point here is that our nation's, this crisis has shone a spotlight on our practice of underfunding the housing and long-term care of our nation's poorest frail elders. As my friend David Grabowski has said, researcher and writer in the area of nursing homes and assisted living and long-term care, you get what you pay for. And indeed, we've chronically underfunded long-term care for our poorest frail elders. And other than in a skilled nursing setting, and in some cases through waivers, in a home and community-based service setting, we don't pay for housing. And even when we do pay, we pay poorly. So hopefully it's a good thing. But the reality is that we've underfunded and then turned away from these citizens and from this area. And now we're sort of waking up as a society with shock and outrage that these residents are so susceptible, that these things are happening in these communities. And to the extent that, yes, there are some communities that are understaffed for what they should be having as staff, and don't have all the training that they need. We've got to understand that just slapping fines and increasing regulation doesn't get at the root of the issue, which is how much do we value the care being provided to the frailest and poorest in our society. I've made several points already about design, but I want to just elaborate a little bit more to say that design in the seniors housing for seniors housing has got to demonstrate how it enables good infection control protocols in congregate settings. I mean, that's obvious, but it needs to be stated. But what does this mean? I think, among other things, that whether you call it a neighborhood approach, small house approach, but I think smaller self-contained neighborhoods that allow for easy segregation of large cohorts are going to be essential in the future. And particularly over the course of and we don't know how long this concern will be there in the broader population. But for right now, I think from both a regulatory and policy point of view and a public perception point of view, we're going to have to be able to answer literally the question on tours and perhaps even in marketing. All right, if there's another COVID-19 type of outbreak, whether it's this virus or another one, how are you able in this large building or housing, whether it's 50 people, 100 people, 300 people or more, how are you able to be able to have protection against spread of infection through your community? So neighborhood models where they're able to be self-contained and they have their own eating areas and so forth. I think there'll be a lot of experimentation there, but I think this is going to spur thinking differently. Another area, a lot of focus has also often been we can make the private, in a sense, personal space, the bedroom, as we don't care how small that is, that personal space living area, because we want people out in the public areas. I think there's going to have to be some rethinking about that, because to a certain extent, this whole epidemic may put a premium on personal space in a way that my friend Joe Coughlin has written about recently in Forbes magazine, and when he talks about the housing impacts of housing models, because there's no question this is broader than just seniors housing and our congregate setting there. This has to do with co-housing models and co-working models. You know, I wouldn't want to be an investor in WeWorks now and so forth, but I think we have to think about how we're going to address that in our congregate settings. And I think we may see a desire now in design for larger personal spaces rather than having huge congregate spaces and sort of public spaces, but tiny personal living spaces. So that'll be interesting to see. As other things I've mentioned, I think the role of communication technology, the ability to have telehealth and telemedicine take place in the community, the role of sensors, whether they're wearables or room-mounted sensors, and I would argue in the future, the role of robots are all going to be critical as we think about the design and functionality of our settings in the future. So, if you haven't guessed it already, I strongly believe that seniors housing, senior living, has got to return to its original value proposition. What do I mean by that? When I first got into this field in the mid-'80s, and for the next couple of decades, it was all about that the primary value proposition of seniors housing and of our congregate setting was about socialization. It was about social engagement. It was about human touch and human connection. It was about providing people a sense of belonging and purpose, all of those things. But as the acuity level of our residents increased, and particularly post the Great Recession, as people put off the move, so that by the time they moved into assisted living or even independent living, their needs were substantially greater. I think we sort of followed the acuity creep, and our marketing, we just simply began to market care because we saw the need was you need care, and we marketed care. Now, that marketing of care is almost going to, I think, work against us, because we've got to be seen as more than care. And our primary value proposition cannot be care. Yes, the care needs to be there and it needs to be good. It needs to be the best. But we've got to be offering much, much more, or else the alternative, which will become increasingly more easier to do, and that is to use home-based technology and to basically stay at home. rather than moving into our communities. The focus cannot be care as the value proposition. The value proposition has got to be on a human level of what it means for the individual. That health, as we know, is not just about quality of health care, and it's not just about genetics, but that the primary contributors are place and environment where you live, and secondly, behaviors. And we, through our congregate settings, have the opportunity to influence the right behaviors and discourage those that lead to poor health. We have the opportunity to increase health span, not just simply take advantage of increased age span. But we've got to return to, I think, that value proposition if we're going to be successful in the future. Okay, last takeaway, and then I'll just go to close with a few questions. To change the perception of the seniors housing setting, and I would say of the seniors housing, and in this case, and long-term care setting, the skilled nursing setting, we must also challenge the pervasive ageism in our society that devalues the lives and contributions of older adults. That in essence, implicit in both statements by public officials and many things stated in the mainstream media over the course of the last month is that somehow or another, older adults, especially older, frail adults, are expendable. And that's because of a view of them as just consumers of limited resources. What I would call a somewhat condescending and patronizing view of our residents as folks that are just there to receive. They don't provide anything back. They're not givers to society. They're just takers. And they're takers of what we now realize are limited resources. So as Louise Aronson, a noted geriatrician out of the University of California, San Francisco, has written, in several places lately, but eloquently in Atlantic. And she's written about how, looking at this ageism, and she said it didn't cause this epidemic, but it's made the response to it much worse. And she talks about how with flu season each year and flu epidemics, that for years we've just kept track of how it hits children and then how it hits adults. And among adults, we've never even separated out 65 plus or 75 plus. But the reality is it does hit that older population much harder. And we've always known that. And the NIC data shows that in terms of occupancy impacts every year. But the implicit assumption, as Dr. Aronson talks about in her article, is that it's not worth tracking because after all, they're just older adults. And in that sense, the implication is they're expendable. And we've got to fight that image, and we've got to fight that underlying ageism. It's entrenched in our healthcare system, but nowhere should it be more rejected than in our communities, where we celebrate the ongoing wisdom, contribution, and value of our elders. One of the things that excites me most is when I hear examples, and I've been hearing lots of them from providers, where rather than seeking to entertain their residents in the midst of this crisis while they're isolated physically in their rooms, are figuring out ways that they can engage their residents in contributing and being part of the fight against COVID-19. And whether it's making masks, whether it's doing online chats with kids who are scared, particularly kids that may be in foster care or in other settings where they don't have now, because they can't go to school, they don't have the normal adult support that they're used to having. But nowhere is it more important to show the contribution back, the value of older adults than in our communities. And I'm so pleased and excited to see some of the stories around some of the things to engage older adults, especially our residents, in being a part of the fight of, part of the solution to responding to COVID-19, rather than just seeing them as casualties or even worse, as expendables, as some have in high-level positions implied or even specifically talked about. Okay, if that isn't enough to shake up your day, I don't know what is. I hope that's given you some thoughts. I want to close now, if I might, Steve, just posing a few questions. These questions, I say they're unknowns at this time, but the answers to them are critical. So if I've given you some things that are sort of looking over the hill being the challenge of this epidemic, and the challenge of mounting all of your team to address this epidemic and to protect and care for your residents. At the same time, here are some, I've offered some takeaways for your future planning, for post-COVID-19, and the things I think will be the new normal. Now I want to end with some questions. So, first question is, will research show that a frail elder with multiple chronic conditions and or ADL needs was safer in the congregate setting of senior living or skilled nursing versus out in the community? I think it will, but we need such research. It's going to be critical, and it's going to be critical that we're able to have evidence-based research that we can use to show what we all believe, and that is that ultimately your loved one is safer in our setting than they are out in the community when there's a public health crisis such as this epidemic. But that is going to be a key thing many people are going to be looking for. And it's going to be critical in terms of the view of our settings. Second question, will skilled nursing homes and by association seniors housing communities be seen as a culprit or a casualty of the COVID-19 pandemic? What do I mean? You're viewed as a culprit if you're seen as, not necessarily you willingly, but if you're a culprit if you're seen as it was your setting or your mismanagement or your hiding what was going on in your community or your inadequate staffing or your poor infection controls. And in a sense, you're a culprit because you suddenly were, in one sense, and I know this sounds like strong language, we're on the side of the enemy, making this or enabling this, it's better, to take so many lives. Or on the other hand, will we be seeing our setting as a casualty? Because we literally were and are on the front lines. We are trying to protect the most precious territory, which is those who are at highest risk because of their multiple chronic conditions, their underlying health issues, and their frailty. And I think this, whether we're viewed as culprit or casualty, is key for our future. And I think we have to be thinking carefully about both the research and the messaging so that we are indeed seen as we are frontline casualties, just like we're seeing frontline casualties amongst healthcare providers and amongst emergency response personnel. Next, how long will the impact of the pandemic linger in terms of a fear in residents about the congregate living setting, especially among boomers? One of the key issues, since the oldest boomer is only 74, is going to be how long this lingers in terms of their fear and reticence about congregate living setting. This is a much bigger issue than just senior living. This has to do with the move back to the city, the downsizing, the love of co-housing, of smaller spaces, of co-working and co-housing. All of those things now are in question. But obviously, they very much impact our setting, especially so many business plans, so many investments hinge on the fact that the boomers are coming. Now, I've been in this field a long time, and a lot of people have been saying that for a long time. But, the oldest boomer is now 74. So I think whether or not this fear of resonance, you almost could call the COVID-19 hangover, is that a matter of months? Is that a matter of a few years? Or is that a matter of a generation? If it's a matter of a generation, that is seriously going to impact a lot of business propositions and investment propositions for the future. Next, how long and how deep will the economic impact of COVID-19 be affecting the affordability of seniors' housing? Again, will we see a recovery that's in terms of the impact, therefore, on the affordability of seniors' housing, that's a V-shaped recovery, steep, quick dip, but also a quick recovery? Is it going to be a matter of 3 or 4 years? Or is it going to be a matter of longer? And I think this issue is key. How much will we see a shrinking of the population that can afford our current product? And how much, therefore, can we step up to the challenge and the opportunity of creating a more affordable private pay seniors housing model? How transparent will our sector be, and will increased transparency lead to greater trust and credibility? It's exciting to see some of the steps that a number of providers have taken to be taking the lead in transparency. And I think it's critical for the reasons I've talked about before. But here I'm talking about our industry, our sector as a whole. Will we be viewed as having been transparent? And will that lead, even though we may be transparent with some awful numbers and tragic impacts, will that greater transparency, increased transparency, lead to greater trust and credibility? And therefore, trust and credibility in our marketing of what we're offering, trust and credibility when we talk about the value of our setting and the safety of our setting. Next, will the industry and its leaders plan and prepare effectively for post-COVID-19 realities, even in the midst of responding to the pandemic? That's the purpose for my wanting to share these comments with you this morning. That, as I picked up on the Henry Kissinger quote, the historic challenge for leaders is to manage the crisis while building the future. We're involved in an awful battle right now, and it's all hands on deck. But I encourage you to begin to think and plan for the post-COVID-19 world that I've tried to give you some insights to, because we've got to be doing this even in the midst of responding to the pandemic. And part of that, I think, will be our ability to gradually move the pendulum back. It's now swung all the way to an exclusive focus on infection control and quality of care. We need to move it back so there's a balance to also the issue of what constitutes quality of life. In the start of the assisted living movement and of private pay seniors housing and of the not-for-profit CCRC or life plan model, it was all about quality of life. It wasn't, first of all, about quality of care. The focus was on life and living, not care and dying. We've got to move that focus back if the future, as I think it can be, is going to be bright for us. So those are some key questions, unknowns at this time. If you want, also challenges to us. So I hope that this has been helpful. I want to stop there. Steve, see if there are some questions. I think we've got some time for some questions. Yes, if you want to reach out to me, here's my contact information now with Nexus Insights. And you can go to nexusinsights.net, www.nexusinsights.net to learn more about that. But let me stop there, Steve, and turn it back to you.
Okay, great. So we've had this big, long, ongoing, very active conversation. And just address a couple questions first, and then we'll get to some questions. Long conversation. We'll go through, clean that up. We'll make it available inside the Kajabi site for registered users. This presentation the video will be there probably tomorrow or the next day. Bob, with your permission, we will also share the slide deck.
That's fine.
Perfect. So
I mean, this slide deck is out there to really help folks. I presented a lot, and you're in the midst of a crisis. So, I realize that this is something you're going to want to pour over and think about. And maybe it's like, hey, we need a break. Let's take an hour and talk about what are the things that are going to most impact us for the future. And I hope this will help.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw it open. I know people have asked questions along the way. I'm not going to try to go back in and find those. If you've got, we can take a couple of questions. If you want to drop a quick question in the chat right now, even if you put it in early, this is your opportunity. I have lots of questions I could ask you, but I know how to find you lots of time. So do you have any best guesses about how long the COVID hangover will last?
The reason I put that as an unknown is that I think it's very hard to say. I mean, as I made clear, I think there's a real danger that it could be a generational impact. I don't think it will be for lots of reasons. One, I believe in the fundamental value proposition that I talked about. I believe that's important for people as human beings. I think when we do it well, it's fantastic and it's incredibly attractive to folks. Secondly, I also believe that though initially the focus will be on the ability to care for people at home, the reality is that for many folks, that ability to care for folks at home gets very, very expensive. And again, there are efficiencies of congregate settings. And so for lots of reasons, the frailty level, just as was discovered, many people said, oh, I want to, some elected officials said, take your loved ones out of senior living communities. But the point was, coordinating medications, coordinating 24-hour oversight, those aren't easy things to do. So, my belief is there'll be some people for whom it'll be a generational impact. For others, and I think they'll be the majority, I think we have the opportunity to win them back. My point, it won't be a value proposition built around care. It'll be a value proposition built around living.
So we have lots of comments and not so many questions. One I do want to address though. Do you think telemedicine will actually help home care, or do you think it'll hurt it compared to senior living?
I think it'll do both.
Okay.
I think the reality is there's no question that the technology is now going to be available for people to receive, whether you call it hospital at home, all these different models. The demand for them has just boomed overnight. And so my point is, the reason we have to change our value proposition, if all we offer is care, technology is going to make it possible for people to get the care at home. The reality is people aren't going to move because of that. They're going to move fundamentally, particularly those that have the means, because of the value proposition in terms of engagement and connection versus being alone. So if we don't counter that, if we stick with we provide care, I believe that the technology of hospital at home and delivering healthcare at home will totally undercut our value proposition if it's all just about care.
Well, and I'm glad you say that. One of the things I'm particularly concerned about right now is we've been so focused in the immediate pandemic of keeping our residents separated from each other, separated from team members, except under very controlled conditions. And I worry about both the impact of those residents who now are, I think about where I live right now in a 2,300 square foot house, and I still go out to the grocery store maybe once a week, and I go out and hike once a week. But if I'm stuck in a 400 square foot room, how do we manage that on a long-term basis? Because there's pretty good evidence that that while we're flattening the curve, the backside of that curve is much longer than the front side.
Yeah, I mean, immediately, I think there are three things that are going to have to happen before we will, in a sense, be able in our sector to view the COVID-19 pandemic in the rearview mirror. One is going to be the availability of rapid tests, meaning tests that give you answers in minutes, not days. You know, for providers to have to wait 2 to 7 days, even if they get the tests, it's frankly of limited value because you can't take the actions you need to take. Two, the antibody information. So we know, you know, who does have the antibodies, and indeed, if that means that they can be safely out in the general population again. And thirdly, a vaccine. And, you know, estimates of a vaccine have run oftentimes more like 12 to 18 months. So I think, you know, I think we're going to need those three things to be in place. They've been talked about nationally as kind of criteria for totally returning back to normal in terms of moving away from the so-called social distancing. Unfortunate phrase, but I think at least in our industry, we will not be looking at COVID-19 in the rearview mirror until those three things are in place. Because given the vulnerability of our population, I don't think we'll have any option but to be very focused on the present until we have the tests, the antibody information that's accurate, and a vaccine. So it means we all have to be pulling and for those three things to be in place sooner rather than later.
Bob, thank you very much. Appreciate your big announcement here. Congratulations on that. Very, very excited about how you're continuing to move the industry forward, your creative thinking on this. We will make the slides available, and we will make the chat available when we get it cleaned up. And of course, the recording of this will be available inside the Kajabi framework in the next few days. So I appreciate it very much. We're going to take about a 10-minute break here, and we will be back to talk about the perils of not answering call systems. I used to work in that industry. It's an area I'm really passionate about. So again, Bob, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope for all of you out there that have been listening, it's been helpful. I look forward to more interaction. I want to point out, Steve, you may be continuing to lose hair during this epidemic and staying at home. I, as you can see, am continuing to gain it. And I'm back to the days that were 50 years ago for me, when my hair is almost has to be tied back in order to not be falling over my eyes. So I'm actually sort of going back in time now, as I'm about a month overdue for a haircut. But well, I've enjoyed the interaction.
I think you ought to go to the ponytail look, and I'd love to see some pictures from those hippie days. So
well,
on the other hand, you know, you might try this. This is pretty easy.
That I can see the simplicity of it.
Of course, I don't have very much to shave anymore, so that makes it extra hair.
Well, thank you, Steve, for this opportunity, and thank you for all you do for the sector. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it.